Hi, everybody. So now we are on to chapter 2, looking at sources of information, why research is best, how to find it. We're building on what we talked about in chapter 1 here. So we're going to look at the research versus your experience, something that we hinted at a little bit in chapter 1. Research versus intuition, which again, we mentioned last week, and then science versus pseudoscience. So we're starting to build on the information in chapter 1, again, still kind of setting the stage of science versus pseudoscience and how we think like a scientist and psychologist. And this chapter is divided up into 2 parts. So we're doing chapter 2, part 1 this week, and then we will do part 2 next week. Let me minimize my video of myself here so I'm not staring at myself. But if we go through this chapter, we're going to look a little bit at, again, the research versus your experience. And our experience doesn't always match up with research, right? And I guarantee you've had that that happen to you in your life. Real life is complicated. It can be very difficult to isolate out every little variable to know what caused what, right? Experiences that we have are confounded, meaning they're complicated. There are other things that get in the way or obscure or cloud the results and make it difficult to know what conclusions that we can make. So what do we do about confounds, right? How do we control for all of these complications or other pieces of information that can confuse our data? We need a comparison group. We need to be a little bit more scientific. And we'll talk about these comparison groups and what they give us and what they add quite a bit in the coming weeks. But let's take an easy example, especially right now with everything going on. Let's say that you are sick, right? You're fighting a cold. Hopefully it is just a cold and nothing else. You take echinacea because you're sick and you start to feel better. Now, was it the echinacea or was it some other factor that made the cold go away? And this is where real life gets complicated. Our experience with our cold and feeling sick is complicated, and we could definitely use a comparison group. Maybe the echinacea was incredibly helpful and that's what made your cold go away. Maybe it was getting sleep or rest or the water that you drank or like a healthier diet. Or maybe it was just time for you to feel better. What if somebody else had the same symptoms and they didn't take echinacea, right? And they didn't get better, right? That might give us some interesting and additional evidence, but it's still complicated or confounded. So we need to consider that real life is often very complicated. It's not simple, right? And so we can't say just because I took echinacea and felt better, that echinacea was the reason that we did improve, right? Maybe and maybe not, right? So our research and our experience are connected, but they don't always match up with each other. Research is definitely better than experience, though. Research is normally much more accurate than our individual experiences, but sometimes our own experiences can contradict research results. They might be an exception to what has been found in research. So a pretty well-known research piece of information is that there is a correlation between smoking and lung cancer, for example. But let's say your grandfather smoked a pack of cigarettes a day and never got cancer, right? He would be an exception to kind of the norm. There are exceptions to our research that we make. It doesn't fit everybody. You may have a friend who never wore a mask and never got COVID, and a friend who wore a mask every single day and still managed to get COVID, right? Research is probabilistic in the sense that conclusions are meant to explain a certain proportion of possible cases or causes, but there are always going to be exceptions. Another example of this, I was always a straight A student, always, all the way through community college, my graduate degree. I got 100% straight A's. I never got anything less than an A. I regret it in a way. It wasn't worth the pressure, just as a side note. But there's typically a very strong correlation or relationship between people who get straight A's and their scores on things like the SATs or the GREs. I was an exception. My scores on those standardized tests were quite low. There are always going to be exceptions to research. And so just because it doesn't always fit your experience doesn't mean that it's not accurate or true. Again, remember that research tends to be probabilistic, and most people will fit that explanation, but not everybody. A lot of us tend to use our intuition when we're trying to gather information about the world. And intuition can actually be really, really helpful. It's a gut feeling, a thing that we know or consider likely from an instinctive feeling rather than maybe using more conscious reasoning. And intuition, again, can guide us in a lot of directions. Like maybe when you meet someone, you have that gut feeling that we're going to be really close, or like, yeah, this isn't going to work, right? And that can help you and guide you. But our intuition tends to be less reliable than we think it is. It can lead to less than effective decisions because most people have biases. We aren't scientific thinkers, at least not all of the time. We can very easily, as people, be swayed by a good story. Somebody can tell you a really good story and it can change your opinion, even though it's something that isn't necessarily reasoning based or empirical in nature. We're also very vulnerable to something called the availability heuristic. We are easily persuaded by what comes to our mind quickly or easily. What is available to us in our mind can easily persuade and shape our opinion. We also tend to be vulnerable to the present or the present bias, failing to think about the things that we cannot see. We're very swayed by what's available, what's in front of us, what are the things going on in the situation in our life tends to very directly shape our opinion and the evidence that we're using to support or refute a claim. We also tend to be victims of confirmation bias. We focus on the evidence that we like best, right? And I guarantee you've all done this. I am guilty of this as well. I love this. I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. Time to do my own research. I'm going to find out the real truth. Literally the first link that agrees with what you already believe, jackpot, right? Facts, right? Confirmation facts. So very, very typical of people to focus on the evidence they like best. You cherry pick the evidence, right? You want something to be true, so you look for things that will confirm your opinion rather than looking for both sides of the situation. We also tend to have a biased blind spot. We believe as people that we are unlikely to fall prey to the biases that we're talking about right now, that other people are more biased than we are. We are literally biased about being biased. And it's a very natural tendency that we have as people. Nothing wrong with it, just important to be aware of it when we're conducting research. And if we're relying on intuition, to remember that it by nature is biased. So the intuitive thinker versus the scientific reasoner, we talk a little bit about this difference between science and pseudoscience. And I mentioned that term in chapter 1's lecture. Pseudoscience, anything that has the word pseudo in front of it, means it's not quite whatever comes next. Pseudoscience, sometimes called fringe science, is almost like science light. It's like a pop version of science. It's a body of knowledge, methodology, belief, or practice that claims to be scientific or is made to appear scientific, but does not adhere to the scientific method, lacks supporting evidence or plausibility, or otherwise lacks a scientific status. Again, sometimes called fringe science. It's on the fringe or the verge of being scientific. Pseudoscience, which is incredibly popular in our culture, tends to ignore the scientific method. It makes conclusions and then looks for facts to support those conclusions, the opposite of what science does. Science uses facts to support the conclusions. This one kind of warps or bends things to fit what we already have. There's no healthy skepticism about fantastic claims in pseudoscience. In fact, if anything, there's almost an enthusiasm to accept that untested personal testimony as a public truth. Right. So when we talk about pseudoscience, there's a little bit of a danger to this, right? When we're making claims that aren't supported by science, people tend to believe them, especially if they're really interesting and fantastic claims. Very important to be thinking about things much more scientifically, but pseudoscience is something that is definitely popular and very prevalent within our culture. In contrast, pseudoscience and intuition, as we talked about in chapter 1, psychology is a science. Science comes from a Latin word meaning knowledge. It's a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. Think about that theory data cycle that we just talked about in chapter 1, right? That round and round approach of hypotheses and theories and data all either confirming or maybe causing us to go back and reevaluate and change our perspective. Some words that tend to go with science, right? So some kind of synonyms or words that are synonymous with it. Science is observable. Science involves things that we can see and feel with our senses, and we can collect in the form of data. It's objective. It's something that is less subjective. It doesn't rely on our personal opinion. It's something that's more free of bias. It's empirical, right? It is systematic and organized, testable and falsifiable. We can go out and make testable predictions about the universe and try to refute them or falsify them. Other people could go out and replicate our research, right? If I make a claim that I have ESP, I almost said ESPN, ESP abilities, right? Somebody could go and replicate the research that I did to show that, and it would either hold up or it wouldn't. Again, systematic, it's something that's organized and formalized, and peer-reviewed. Other people within the field, other experts are looking at it and trying to also see if they agree or disagree. So when we embrace the principles of science, we're embodying a scientific attitude, which is composed of curiosity, a passion for exploration, skepticism, doubting and questioning, and humility, an ability to accept responsibility when we're wrong. And I feel like I just had this conversation with my partner yesterday, right? We were talking about wanting to go on a cruise in a time of, COVID, in the COVID pandemic, and which was much better as of a couple of weeks ago than it is right now, depending on when you're watching this video. But with the cruise, like I was like, oh, I'm sure it's safe to go on a cruise. Like everybody has to be vaccinated, you have to wear a mask. But I'm curious, right? So I'm going to go online and I'm curious. I want to know more. I'm going to explore. And I go on and I'm looking up information. What are the safety measures people are using on cruises? How dangerous is it to go on a cruise with other people? I'm skeptical, though. The articles that I read, who wrote them? Right? Was the article written by Carnival, who's trying to convince you to go on a cruise because they have money invested in it? Or was it written by the CDC or somebody with knowledge in infectious diseases who can give me valid and good information that is true? And then I have humility, an ability to accept responsibility when I was wrong. Cruises are not safe at all, right? And I can accept that, right? And go back and I can give you reasons why. And I can reevaluate that at any time, looking at when things are published in the world around me and other confirming data and so on. So these are things that as scientists and researchers, we do all the time, whether it be formal or more informal and more personal. When we like someone who's using intuition, we make mistakes when we base our reasoning on intuition rather than science. I love this. Oops. Right? So when we use nothing but intuition and like gut feelings and what's available to us, we tend to make some mistakes in our reasoning. Versus researchers can create comparison groups. They can control for confounds or things that are going to complicate or confuse information, and they can look at all of the data. So when we use research and scientific approaches, we nail it, right? Nailed it. And we tend to be better at coming up with a more objective, empirical, and sound conclusion. Now, of course, this isn't always the case. Sometimes intuition can be very accurate and science can be completely wrong. But in general, research and these scientific methods and scientific ideas that we're talking about tend to be better at giving us good conclusions and controlling for all of those complicated variables. So that is the end of the first part of chapter 2. Next week, we'll look at the second part where we start to get into some other ideas and concepts building on this knowledge. But make sure that you are completing all of the required materials for this week and get going on all that before the posted deadline. And I will see you all next week for our next topic, the second half of chapter 2.